previously worked as an economist at the European Central Bank and the ECB. And oh yeah. Okay, so let me summarize rules of the game. The seminar will take about a couple of hours. We have maybe less today since we are late. Federica will present her work in about 1 hour, during which I will omit only spotlight questions, so technical clarification and so on. While we're going to have a long discussion after the presentation, in which I will encourage you to ask questions, clarification, and very important, the seminar today is going to be recorded. So for those of you who prefer not to be recorded, please leave the room and follow the webinar, the seminar on our official YouTube channel. And Adriana is in charge to collect questions from our online attendees. And I think that's all. I'm very happy after 2 years to say, Federica, the floor is yours, since we are all in presence. And thank you.
Thank you. I think you all hear me. I'm just going to speak louder. Can you hear me?
I think it, yeah. No.
Can you hear me? Okay. So thanks. Apologies for the delay and the technical problems. I'm very happy to be here. This is the first seminar in person since, again, like a couple of years. And thank you for the invitation, for hosting me here at the GSSI. So this is a joint paper with my co-authors, Mariona, Yusuf, and David. This paper is about the evaluation of the economic impact on the city of Paris of the construction of a large bike lane network. You might be aware of the fact that there is increasing pressure for cities to develop bike lanes, to move to more sustainable transport modes. And the city of Paris has been at the forefront of this recent shift by cities around Europe, especially to develop large-scale transport networks to make room for more sustainable transport modes, such as cycling. More specifically, the question that we want to ask here is, given that this is an infrastructure investment that is taking place, but which is largely unexplored because it is relatively recent, it's not like the building the high-speed trains or building a highway. There is plenty of literature analyzing this transport investment. But what is the impact of these recent types of transport investments on the internal organization of cities? Because you might also be aware that, I mean, in certain cities, this type of investment is highly divisive and generates opposition from certain interest groups. And so the question that we ask is, we borrow from the literature or the economic geography literature, according to which basically building a highway, building a railway increases the market that firms located along this highway can access, because this highway makes more, this new transport infrastructure makes easier to move goods, to move people, and therefore it increases the number of opportunities that a firm can access. These opportunities are, we're talking about customers more specifically. So that this mechanism applies also to bike, when you build bike lanes in a city. On the one hand, we might think, but it's not exactly the same thing, because a bike lane in a city is replacing for alternative transport modes. So if there are now more customers coming to the shop via bikes, there might be fewer customers coming by car. And so is the revenues of local shop owners increasing after build a bike lane in front of him? It's not clear. On the other hand, though, you could think that by cycling, it's a more it's a transport mode that spurs perhaps more consumption, because it's an active mobility transport mode. If you are cycling, you're also probably walking more down the street. And we all know that one thing that matters, especially for these local businesses, such as shops and restaurants, is that there are people walking in front of them. Because if you walk in front of them, you are more likely to shop inside. And so by building a bike lane, if this spurs a modal shift towards more active mobility transport modes, such as walking and cycling, in replacement of public transport and cars, this might spur a higher level of consumption, might increase demand for the local firms located along this bike lane. So the literature we refer to is the one that has analyzed the impact of transport infrastructure investment in general. More recently, this literature has taken the so-called market access approach. That means that economists are not just looking at the impact of on a given specific location of there being a highway or not. It's not important. It's not sufficient to have a highway. It's important what this highway connects you to. And so similarly for bike lanes, if you are building a bike lane from the center or from the periphery that actually goes towards, I don't know, a non-populated area, probably this is not going to increase your market access, because this infrastructure is not an end per se, it's a means towards something. And so this is the market access approach that represents an improvement, a measurement improvement of the potential benefits, economic benefits from transport infrastructure. We also borrow from the literature that basically increasingly relies on very detailed micro data to analyze the impact of local policies. For example, we're going to use car transaction data. So there is a large chunk of literature that is increasingly using this type of data that are becoming increasingly available, thankfully, to track the changing geography within cities subject to a large infrastructure plan, which I'm going to show you in a second. There is a cycling economics literature that has been, we dubbed it this way, my co-author, has been mostly concerned so far on the impact of cycling networks, mostly from a health perspective and from a pollution perspective. Here we are interested on how bike lanes, a large bike lane network, affects revenues, sales of local businesses. So we quantify the impact on the non-tradable sector of the construction of this network, where basically our key variable of interest is this so-called bike market access. What is bike market access? It's a notion that takes the perspective of a merchant, of a shop, of a restaurant. It means how many customers can potentially reach my shop, my restaurant, via this new infrastructure, via the available infrastructure by bike. Okay, it doesn't correspond to how many people effectively are going to come, but if now that shop becomes more easily accessible thanks to the changing transport network, the potential demand is going to increase for this owner. And we want to know how effectively revenues for them, for these merchants increase. We rely on changes in market access triggered by this transport infrastructure investment. And how we identify, so there could be some, you might argue, you haven't talked so far about identification. It's possible that certain parts of the city are getting connected earlier than others, or instead of others, because perhaps there was an intention from the policymaker to connect less developed area, or there was an intention to connect already fast growing areas. Right? I mean, the placement of bike lanes might not be random, but we, by taking this network approach, we basically look at how market access in a specific place, in a specific neighborhood, changes thanks to investments, thanks to bike lanes taking place distant from this very same location. So this endogeneity concern is attenuated because we let basically developments slightly farther away drive the benefits that we are identifying. So we find that the average improvement in bike market access translates into a 3% average improvement in revenues for the retail sector and for the restaurant sector. And this effect is larger in the retail sector and for smaller businesses. And we argue that this matches a trial that you might have. Basically, what I told you before, the footfall externalities is probably larger for the retail sector. In the restaurant sector, which is the other large sector we focus on, because these are the two main local non-tradable goods which are exchanged in cities, shops and cafes, restaurants, also gyms, I mean, all non-tradables. But these are the two main sectors we have in the analysis. These externalities coming from the fact that you walk rather than just go to a place and shop in that place, but you walk along the street, and so you can stop in multiple locations. We argue that this is more likely to take place in the retail sector. You don't shop in a restaurant, grab a bite, and then go to the next one, grab a bite there, and so on and so forth. You just go to one location. So we find a very strong effect in the retail sector. And for smaller businesses, which might be the ones that are more affected by asymmetrical informational asymmetries, the ones that are less salient. And now, instead of taking the metro, you are going on the surface, you're traveling on the surface, and so these shops become more salient. And those are the ones that are more affected. So what is going on here? Okay. Yeah?
That would be expected to be a picture.
That would be expected to be a very nice gift, but it's not. I mean, maybe if I do this, no. I have many gifts in this presentation, so it's a pity if it's not. No, this one is also not working. Okay. Okay. Well, I mean, so this is the city of Paris, and this is the first the Plan Velo, which is this infrastructure network, is about 80 kilometers, and in the original GIF, so the blue lines are the bike lanes developed in each quarter during 2017, 2019. And this, I believe, is the first quarter. So by the end of the period, you have to trust me, this looks a way more blue. There are many more bike lanes going on in the city. And yeah, we had a few technical problems today, so I mean, just have to trust me. Maybe I can send you the slide afterwards. Overall, it's about 60 kilometers being developed of bike lanes for a substantial investment, 150 million. The initial project was 80 kilometers. So by 2019, which is the last year of the mayor mandate, which ended in 2020, about like 75% of these bike lanes have been built, and then following that, the remaining 20 kilometers were built, but we had to stop our sample in 2019, end of 2019 for obvious reasons. So our last month is December 2019. So where do we get our data? We have, we basically scrape data on the development of the bike lane over time. We have daily updates, but clearly not every day there was a large bike lane being opened. So we collapsed it at the quarterly frequency, and we operate with the quarterly frequency from July 2019 to November 2019. These are geolocalized, so we know in each specific point of the city where there is this new bike lane open. And when I say bike lane, I mean a properly done bike lane, okay? I mean, you might have seen stripes painted on the street. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the specific lane separated from the rest of the traffic. And I don't have it in this presentation, but we see a very strong correlation with the amount of cyclists going on through these bike lanes at the city level, unfortunately. We have this, the cyclist information only at the city level, so we don't use it in this paper. Well, we know where the new bike lanes are. Then we have data on economic activity. How do we measure it? Basically, for each car transaction taking part in France, we know the value, we know the location. We can match the location to the business registry, the French business registry. So we know exactly the code for that business, for that shop owners. We know the sector. We also know the average size, the age. And that's it. I will show you this is fairly representative data of overall aggregate activity. And we retain these non-tradable sectors. So restaurants, shops, gyms, theaters, cinemas, I mean, non-tradables, okay, sold locally. Then we have a very large set of neighborhood characteristics, the usuals. So, yeah, this is basically the representation. So on these are the various sectors that we are using, and the very rightmost column corresponds to the ratio between the overall value of sales measured in our data set and the value of sales measured in national accounts. So our data for France. So overall our data set, which is the universe, comprises the universe of car transactions, captures about 53, between 50 and, yeah, I mean, much, it can capture also as a small percentage, but the first three sectors comprise 98% of transactions in our data set. So let's just focus on retail and restaurants for simplicity. Then of course also bakeries are important in France, but just in France. So we, our market, I mean, any market access perspective, if you want to evaluate the impact of a transport infrastructure and go beyond the simple, okay, let's put on the right-hand side of our equation a dummy for 0, 1, whether there is a highway or not. If you want to calculate a market access indeed metric, this market access metric has to be derived from an underlying model. There is no other way, because basically the market access metric implicitly accounts for consumers optimization problems, for their utility optimization problems, where they are going to shop and how much they are going to demand of each individual good. So you need to have a model on the background to derive this measure. Okay, there is no other way, because otherwise you are not able to estimate what is the potential demand. What is the potential demand? Potential demand comes from the solution of a utility maximization problem. So we have this simple problem on the background, which is, let's assume partial equilibrium. The city is divided in many neighborhoods. In each neighborhood, there is a given population. And this individual living in neighborhood J has to decide how much to consume of housing, of a tradable and a non-tradable good, which is the one that we are interested in. And that's the utility it takes place. The non-tradable good, they can decide to purchase it in a different location from the one where they live. And here comes the commuting problem, because the location where they're going to choose where to buy the non-tradable good is going to depend on two things, basically, other than on the price. It's going to depend on how nice is the location, the destination location, the amenities in the destination location, and on the bilateral distance. And if, thanks to a new infrastructure, the effective bilateral distance between the origin point, which is where the consumer lives, and the destination point, which is where the merchant has the business, shrinks thanks to an upgraded infrastructure, this bilateral cost is going to reduce, it's going to go down, and the share of people that might decide to commute to that location will increase.
I have a spotlight question. You're assuming that utility function refers to the leisure time. So right?
To the leisure.
Thinking about leisure time or
Yeah,
including working time.
Yeah, no, I mean, no, this is, we are not modeling the, I mean, it's your point, but we are not modeling it this way. So the bilateral commuting cost, as you can see, acts more as a preference shifter rather. So there is no choice of how to allocate your time.
That's because it's assumed the working time,
yeah,
a fixed set of location where it used to buy.
This is a cost that, so here, every individual has 1 unit of time and spends it working. But then they also want to consume, this is called Douglas, so they need to consume the non-tradable good, and they are just gonna choose the locations which for given level of amenities, you see the term, the shifter is this one. This Dij is the bilateral distance. So this enters this. The higher is this bilateral distance, the lower is utility. So the individual will try to minimize this bilateral distance by going to the closer, at the same time, nice, this comes from the preference parameter location. So if you solve this model, and by the way, you can find a more elaborated version in Gorbach 2020, you get that basically the share of individuals living in location J that purchase the non-tradable good in location I takes this expression. Why? Because this preference shock is fair share distributed, so you can derive a closed form solution for it. And this is it. So what are the various terms? So EI is amenities. We assume that these are constant over time. Also, we do not measure them. So we're going to abstract from varying amenities from this parameter that captures how nice it is to basically consume in a given place. What is going to vary over time is Dij, the bilateral cost. The lower this is, the higher is the share of consumers of the flows from location I to location J. So we measure, how do we measure these bilateral distances? Let's define this biomarker axis, which is basically this formula simply rescaled by income in location J, okay? So this is overall income, population, employment rate, median income. This defines total income that can be spent on the non-tradable good in the origin destination. We take these parameters from the literature, tau and epsilon. These have been estimated by urban economics spatial models of that evaluate basically the impact on the internal distribution of the city of changes in market access. So we borrow them from the literature and we measure the Dij, which is the key methodological contribution of the paper, because what do? We divide the city. Here is another GIF which doesn't play. We divide the city in many pixels. These pixels are really small. They are like 200 by 200 meters. And we know inside each of these pixels, house prices, income, the revenue of merchants. We know whether there is a bike lane, whether there is a park. We know basically everything of these small pixels. We basically overlay this map. The OpenStreetMap here is this one is playing. No, it's not playing. No. Here is another GIF that doesn't play. So this is OpenStreetMap data. You can download from OpenStreetMap different types of the network. So this is the road network in Paris. I don't know if you can see, it's a cobweb, but we know for each pixels whether there is a road, whether there is a building, whether there is the river. In Paris, there is a river, whether there is a bike lane. And we basically assign to each of these small pixels a value, a cost, corresponding, capturing the cost of crossing the pixel. Remember that the consumer has to move across the space, and this is costly. He's trying to minimize how much time it takes to go from point A to point B. And given that he is a biker, he doesn't just want to take a road because he might end up on an urban highway. He wants to take a bike lane, right? I mean, if you have to choose where to go and there is a bike lane and there is a non-bike lane, you will take the bike lane. So pixels with the bike lane on top of it receive a lower cost so that the consumer, precisely as Google Maps suggests you to do when you enter a destination, will suggest you to take the bike lane rather than other ways. And so we basically construct an algorithm the same way as Google does. You enter an origin, you enter a destination, you enter a bike transport mode, and you let Google tell you what is going to be the path you're going to take. We do this with this a similar version of this course, we're not Google, so we take a different approach. It's called the fast marching method algorithm that, given this cost raster and given all the possible combination of origins and destinations, tell you what is the route you take. And given all the possible routes, then for each origin pair, or for each origin, tells you which is what is the cost basically of reaching all the other ones. So this is how it looks like. This is the sun, the cost raster before, the cost raster after. I don't know if you see here, there is a slightly lighter line. This slightly lighter line corresponds to the Plan Velo, the bike lanes. This gift basically should have been the different cost of going from point A here, Hotel de Ville, the city hall, the red dot, going to all the other parts, okay? And darker, basically darker spots are places where the bilateral distance is lower, and the greener where it's higher. And the GIF should have shown the evolution of the network, how this bilateral cost evolve as the bike lanes get built. So this is luckily not a GIF, but I don't know if you see much of these colors. I see them well. So basically, this is how the variation of bike market access, this indicator I showed you before, this is, let's call this bike market access, which we can, which we now know because we have calculated all this bilateral cost at any point, at any given time for any origin destination pair. We can calculate the variation between the starting of the sample 2017 and the end of the sample 2019 and plot this variation, where green dots are places that gain market access and orange dots are places that lost market access. And in black, now you finally see how the Plan Velo looks like. So these are the black lines are the originally planned bike lanes, and these are the effectively built bike lanes at the end of 2019.
The few spots are definitely fewer.
There are fewer, it's true. So there are, the green ones are about 40% of the sample. So this is clearly, let's call it like a zero-sum game, in the sense that demand increases in one location at the expenses of others. It's not that this infrastructure is making overall expenditures in shops and restaurants increase. We don't believe this is what is actually happening. We think that this policy had more of a redistribution impact across the city. Some locations were advantaged rather than others. So there are a few peculiarities. The first one, you see that you can clearly, I mean, I don't know if you can clearly, but this graph is meant to show also the network nature of this investment. Basically, in places where there was a bike lane, but this bike lane didn't connect basically with the others, like this one, for example, there is not much of an increase because this bike lane, you know, starts here, ends there, and doesn't connect. So this is the first point. The second point is that even if, I don't know, this location got connected with this one, the one in the middle benefited the most. And why is that? Because not all locations have the same spending power. In Paris, like many other cities, people live around here in the more peripheral suburbs, which is not the banlieue, by the way. Banlieue is outside here. This is just the city of Paris. Nobody lives in the city center because there is where you have tourists, where you have financial investment, the prices are very expensive, so nobody lives here. So if you build a bike lane connecting this very populated area with this one, the one that has the most to gain from it, I mean, the shop owners that have the most to gain from these connections, they're not these ones, they're here, because they can now access this very large pool of potential customers. So this policy, in effect, in a way, you know, by its structure, by its kind of radial structure cutting through the center of the city, had the effect of advantaging central location and this and at the cost of more peripheral location. There is a large literature, which not in the context of cities, but rather in the context of highways, shows that circular rings around cities help the periphery, while radial rings departing from the city center and going towards the suburbs help the city center at the disadvantage of peripheries. Because these radial highways connect a very attractive location with less attractive locations. And so these less attractive locations, they are gonna be pulled towards the city center. While if you connect the suburbs, you strengthen the peripheral neighborhoods. So this is how this literature suggests, bottom line is that if you want to, depend what's your objective functions, but if you want to help disadvantaged location, you should create more circular infrastructure rather than radial. And what they did a radial infrastructure, which has its advantages because clearly cuts through the city center. So from a network perspective, it maximizes for sure the output. So let me go to the analysis. So our estimation strategy basically puts on the right-hand side of our equation this bike market access metric, which we've seen varies over time and across space. On the left-hand side, we have the log of the total value of car transaction taking place in a given quarter across merchants located in this very small area, 200 by 200 meters. Alternatively, the total number of transactions or the average value of transactions of these two sectors, retail and restaurants primarily. We have a number of time varying control variables. We have fixed effects at the grid level. I mean, this is a 2-year period, so it's relatively short term. We don't believe that the nature of this neighborhoods is changing so much within 2 years. What is changing is really that the looks of the street in some parts of the city changed dramatically within 2 years, with a drop in the number of cars used and an increase in the uptake of bikes. Now, going back to the identification problem, it's possible that the placement of a bike lane in a given area is endogenous to the characteristics of and the evolution over time of local activity. How do we take care of it? We said that this bike market access metric, given that it's built based on the entire network and does not depend on having a bike lane in front of my shop or not, we can basically control for the density of bike lanes in front of each, like in the very same area at the eye level. I identifies these small pixels that we built around the city. And therefore let our beta, which is the impact of an increase in bike market access, be identified only by developments of the bike network in other neighborhoods. In other neighborhoods where we think that it's less likely to be endogenous. We also have some narrative accounts that the placement, the timing of, and also we have some alternative tests that corroborate this narrative evidence. The timing doesn't really reflect the evolution of like local characteristics. We don't see that places that became over time more populated or where unemployment went down received the transport network access to the bike lanes earlier than others. Also because, as you saw, this took place mostly around 2 axes. So, I mean, in all the other parts of the city, this is likely to be independent of conditions, whether they were closed or not. We don't use an instrument. We use this approach of controlling for the local density, and as a robustness check, we exclude. So since there is an original plan and there are some areas where the roads were not built, we focus on, as an instrument, we select all the grid cells that are cut by the original plan, and we know that some of them are treated, some of them are not, and So if
Probably the ones that are connected are more what's affected.
yeah, no, so I mean, by selecting this subsample of cells where there was the intention to build the bike lane, we are further, I mean, we are implicitly doing that because we are excluding those where there was no intention, which we might think are structurally different, just focusing on those that got it. And then we show you that within the subsample of locations, I'm going to show you to you in a second, of locations that got the bike lanes, that where there was a planned bike lane, we do a balancing test between those that got treated eventually and those that didn't, and they are not different along any dimension. So I don't know if this answers your question. So the baseline evidence is represented here. So we have these three outcomes. This is the euro values of how much money is spent in a given 200 by 200 meter cell in a specific quarter. Volume is the number of transactions. Average value is the ratio between them. And the coefficients represented here are the betas. Why there are multiple columns? Because we try a few robustness for this local bike lane density control, which allows us to control for local development. So here we don't have any local bike lane density control. Here we add as a control the length of the bike lane that is, I don't know, like you live in this neighborhood, the bike lane that you have in front of you is a specific road. So we add the length of that road. So any change in bike market access accounts for the specifics of that road.
Can you control for other characteristics of the areas that do not pass through bike?
We're going to show, we are going to, so what we are going to do in one of the robustness check, we're going to control for car traffic. Yes, we're going to control for car traffic and show you that the coefficient of like the association between car traffic and revenues, if anything, is negative. You might think that, I don't know, it is actually true that shop owners perhaps prefer more pedestrianized streets. For them, it's better. So more cars makes the street less safe for pedestrians. And so this coefficient, the coefficient is unchanged when we introduce it, but I'm going to show it to you in a slide. So the impact is positive. Basically, how do we interpret this coefficient? We did some back of the envelope calculation. We basically divide grids into those that got that got treated and those where bike market access increased, or in those where it decreased. Remember that in the slide I showed you before, some cells were dark green and some others were dark orange, so not everybody benefited. For winners, the average improvement, if you accumulate from 2017 to 2020, and you calculate the average increase in monthly revenues, you get an average 2% increase, which is not that large, but it's also not super small. And also because this is an improvement for each month. Clearly, if you got access to the network earlier, your accumulated benefit will be larger. But if you stack all these individual improvements, you get to a substantial euro value of this infrastructure, which on the other hand, though, impacted negatively some other locations. However, for these locations, the average decline in business volume due to the network seems to be of smaller magnitude, if anything. Are there any questions? Okay, so as a robustness check, I told you we are focusing just on these pixels that where there had to be some bike lanes. Eventually, some got treated, the blue ones, and some did not. And if you compare these two samples, so you do a balancing test, what I was telling you before, I mean, basically these locations are very similar along the observable characteristics. We also did a timing of treatment test. So basically, among the locations that got treated, because the balancing test basically accounts for cross-sectional endogeneity. But here there is an additional threat to identification, which is given by the timing of treatment, given that this is a panel data. So for each treated cell, we regress the date when they got treated on certain like a socioeconomic characteristic of the location. We repeat this for several points in time. We do this exercise in 2017 Q2, taking all the cells that haven't been treated yet. We repeat it, so there are 271, which are left to be treated. We do it 1 year later. The cells that are left to be treated are 2001. We take the time when they're going to be treated, we regress it on this socioeconomic characteristics, XI. We do it 1 year later. The bottom line from this table is that, I mean, none of this none of this predictor appears to systematically be capable of explaining at any given time in time the evolution of the network. And the balancing test supports also the view that these two sets are overall similar. So if we focus on this smaller sample, we get similar results, if anything larger. We don't have a prior on what was the endogeneity, the sign of endogeneity potential in the previous location, because when you build infrastructure, you have two potential signs of endogeneity. You can build infrastructure to connect less developed areas, therefore giving them access, giving them opportunities. In this case, if you were not accounting for endogeneity, you would be underestimating the effect, You can give the infrastructure to locations which are, on the other hand, booming. I mean, some policymakers decide to equalize, to provide equal access to all regions or cities. In that case, you would be overestimating the impact. So there are two potential signs where the bias can go, and if there is any bias in the previous regression I showed you, it seems to be a downward bias, meaning that potentially they decided to, I mean, the mayor, if there was any intention to systematically assign the bike lanes to areas rather than some others, decided to do it with areas which are growing less fast, perhaps to equalize access to infrastructure.
Sorry, could you go back to the previous slide? I didn't get exactly what this figure represents. So have you estimated the effect on plan?
We're estimating the effect on so in the first regression, we were using all pixels, and now we are just using pixels, the blue and the green ones, which are the pixels where not necessarily developed.
Okay, this is kind of mentioned.
Yes. Okay. So these are the assumption behind the credibility of our robustness check is that this is a more homogeneous sample than the previous one, because they were all there was for all of these an intention to be treated if we want to use the potential outcomes.
Yeah. Okay. I'll be asked
Okay, so we look also at the effect on other variables such as car traffic. You might think that if you build a bike lanes, where are the cyclists coming from? They're switching from another transport mode. Now, we don't have access on data on public transport usage, but we know car traffic from geolocalized sensors scattered around the city. And we see that car traffic, after there is the development of a bike lane in a given specific area, declines. We don't detect a positive, we detect a positive, but not statistically significant impact on business entry. And you might I mean, this was a bit puzzling for us because we were expecting that when there is an expansion in market access, there is more opportunity also for potential new firms. So we were expecting to find an increased take-up of an increase in business entry. But it's possible that, I mean, this theory of the impact of market access on business entries typically comes from from trade models. In a city environment, business entry is subject to a number of additional constraints. The first and foremost constraint is the value of renting a shop and the availability of renting a shop. Is not so easy. I mean, creating a firm, creating a shop has potentially high costs, also fixed cost, and plus Paris is not really the cheapest city where to start anything. So we don't find anything on this. I told you that we look at sectoral heterogeneity. Our impact seems to be mostly driven by the retail sector rather than the restaurant sector. And here, how we do explain this? We explain this in terms of the fact that not only the construction of a bike lane triggers a take-up in cycling, but this type of transport mode might be more compatible with additional expenditure if it spurs, let's say, additional works that make a given street more pedestrian friendly. If a given street is more pedestrian friendly, if you talk to any business owner, any merchant will tell you that more people are going to come to his shop because people walk by, there are footfall externalities. There's also
differences in the time for consuming the two things.
There are also, yes, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. We further then, I mean, we divide the grid cells into grid cells where there is predominance of small firms, predominance of young firms. We introduce and we add an interaction effect to our model, and we look at whether there is an interactive effect of an increase in bike market access in location where the average firm size is smaller. This is this column. Or average age size, average firm age is greater. Sorry, this is larger and this is age greater. The coefficient of on the interaction with the dummy standing for greater average firm size is negative, which means that basically, if you just add these two coefficients in locations where merchants tend to be larger, you can think of large surfaces. This coefficient is this impact is smaller. How do we explain this? It's possible that by switching to more active mobility transport mode, people, instead of taking the metro, they're just living on the street more, and this means that they are more aware when they go to work. They just see all the different places. Before, they were not seeing them because they were taking the metro. They were entering from point A to point B and missing all the new shops or restaurants that opened on the way. And this helps especially smaller businesses, but we don't have further data too. We would like to, I mean, we're trying to see whether we can substantiate this claim, because at the moment it's just a hypothesis. So I told you that I wanted to show you one robustness check, which is this one. So we add for a variable, which is the number, I mean, the log of the number of cars transiting each of these grid cells at any given point in time. We add it as a control variable to our baseline regression. And this is the estimated coefficient. It's negative, not statistically significant. And our coefficient of interest is not changed. So we think that, I mean, it's true that we think that cars benefit shops because you can park directly in front of it. But if these cars create congestions and make shops less easily reachable by people by walk and by bike, the truth is, this paper shows that there might be a potentially negative impact. While if you make the street more likable for cyclists or walkers. There could be a positive impact. Additional, yeah. So I'm just going to conclude. So basically what we found in this paper, which we are still working on, so any comment, any suggestion is very appreciated. Investment in cycling infrastructure can impact positively local economic activity, especially now after COVID, that these sectors were heavily hit by the pandemic, and there is, I mean, it's in the mind of policymakers how they can be actively supported because they were, I mean, heavily supported, subsidized during the pandemic. But now, which we do not know whether we are gonna, I mean, there is also the potential threat of smart working, which you might have heard. I mean, and the anecdotal evidence suggests that this might be hurting, especially shop owners and businesses in the city centers. I mean, one way to tackle this problem, while at the same time having a large sum of, I mean, of money to invest into a more sustainable transport infrastructure mode, is to think of this problem jointly. Okay, think about how this additional investment, which we need to make, the National Resilience and Recovery Plan asks us to do that, how these projects can be planned in a way such as to favor certain categories which we want to support, actively support. I mean, the policymakers want to actively support. So one way is to invest in cycling infrastructure, think about the right shape of cycling infrastructure. If you want to, being aware that this infrastructure, the way you design it across the city is going to benefit more some areas rather than some others. So maybe do some, you know, take this into account when you do cost benefit analysis and evaluate ex ante the impact of infrastructure. And that additionally to the impact for local shop owners, that might be other types of benefits accessible to the whole population, not just to firms, such as improved amenities, less car traffic, probably less pollution, which has already been shown in other papers. So I'm done. If there are any questions.
So, given that we have just one microphone, I would kindly ask you if you can use this one. If it works. Does it work? I don't know. Let's try. Oh yeah, yeah, it seems to work. So here, while I'm going around to ask questions here. Okay. Given that we have just one microphone, that's why.
Okay.
Okay, Federica, thank you very much. I think this is a very interesting and complete work. Really appreciate it. I have a bunch of questions, but before speaking, the policy is to give priority to our PhD students. So, guys, if you have questions, yeah, sure. Also, questions coming from our online channel. So, okay. Females first. Okay, Francesca.
So thank you very much. It's a very interesting paper for me. And I have two comment questions, let's say. The first one is, can you control for parking availability? Because I guess that areas that have larger parking availability will maybe, you know, and also the fact that by building lane, by building cycling lane, you may lose parking. So there might be like a double effect there that can be controlled. And the other one is that there is a growing literature now on the fact that demand is heterogeneous, and so you can have like people that prefer to go by bike when they are allowed. They may have different preferences with respect to those that prefer to go by car, and so maybe this can be the explanation for the small business gaining, because maybe small businesses are like have different characteristics that can satisfy better those that prefer going by bike. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Francesca.
or if you want.
If you want, yeah, you can reply now.
Thanks for these questions. So we do not have information on new parking lots being built. We control for rate fixed effects, and if there is any, I mean, we suppose that there are parking space being taken away. This is typically, I mean, I don't know, not necessarily typically what happens, but it's possible that happens, and we see that car traffic reduces. So overall, going through the streets becomes clearly more burdensome for cars, and less cars want to go there, either because they cannot or because they don't want to. This we do not know. To the second question, I mean, we control for some local characteristics. We know, for example, we control for the share of residents between 25 and 39, and we find this to be actually a very important predictor of like local business activity revenues in these two sectors that we focus on, because I mean, we know that most of these are the most dynamic consumer group. We control for them. We cannot do further heterogeneity though, because in the credit cards data set, we don't have information on who spends what, who consumes on what. Maybe? Yeah, this is something that we want to do because we have data on TripAdvisors, but I mean, we were a bit deterred from doing that because we do not see an impact on restaurants. I mean, there could be an impact within the restaurant sector. We could see some, because we do expect to see some gentrification effect taking place. You know, if there is a bike lane, the neighborhood becomes nicer. Younger families move in, maybe more artsy family move in, maybe these are places where rents and house prices were lower, now rents and house prices start. This is the definition of gentrification, no? When high income group come into relatively low, like poor neighborhood. This might be happening, and we want to, by looking at TripAdvisor data, when we have information on the characteristics of the restaurant, we want to see whether we find something. But since for the restaurant sector as a whole, we couldn't find a statistically significant impact, we waited a bit, but we're going to use this information. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Federica. Question from Carlo.
Thank you. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. I think that you are trying to tackle a very complicated issues because of this huge amount of potential disturbing variables, let's say. My question is regarding the case study. So I would like to know your opinion on the generalizability of this study, because to the best of my knowledge, Paris is a very peculiar city in terms of its characteristics, and I'm thinking about the dimension of the streets within the city. And so, I mean, there is physically a lot of space to build proper bike lanes, not restricting too much the space for the normal traffic. So that's it. Thank you very much.
I mean, I think that this is a very valid point. I think that the results of this study might generalize. The extent of generalizability depends on how similar is the city you want to compare this result, these findings with. How similar are the different transport mode shares across the cities. Like if you wanted to compare these results with a city such as Rome, where by cycling take-up is very low, many people the vast majority of people take the car. We know from surveys, we know this is anecdotal evidence, that most bikes take-up doesn't come from car, it comes from public transport. People that were taking public transport now take the bike. So in cities where there is already a high take-up of public transport, maybe these findings generalize more. In cities where there is a lot of car dependence, and so car usage, I don't like to think of it as a preference. It's mostly dictated by the availability of public transport. But maybe, there is also a preference, a cultural parameter in these cities. It might be more difficult to transition to a different transport mode, such as cycling, for example, from cars. I don't know if this is.
Since there are no other questions, online questions, do you have other questions, guys? Not for now. Sandra? Okay. Let's go.
First of all, I would like to congratulate for this very rich kind of work, and I think it's a good starting for the new cohort of students that we have here. We have a new cohort of students for this is the very first seminar, and I'm pleased that this is one. It is very complete in terms of literature backgrounding, in terms of modeling, in terms of originalness and accuracy of empirical data. So good. Having said that, it seems to me that, as I told you before, that the most relevant kind of controls that you have for the areas pass through the information that comes from the use of Velo, from the use of a biking system, right? And here comes the questions that were stimulated by complaints that I got from people working with CD about how often Velo does not work. And which is something I think could be easily detected. And I'm wondering to which extent the Velo system works homogeneously across the different areas, and if you could eventually detach, I don't know, a number of interruptions of the systems per day or something like that.
Thank you, Sandra.
I mean, we had negotiations with the, so Velib is the city public provider of public bikes provider. We had multiple talks with them, tried to convince them to give us the data. We didn't manage, so okay. Unfortunately, okay. But we would have liked to, yeah.
Thank you very much, Federica. It was a great presentation, as Sandra mentioned. And I really buy your story, and thank you, because you also made me reason on my own consumer behavior. I lived in cities, plenty of bike lanes, and I was using bikes all the time, and in cities where I was just going by bus or tube. And in fact, I really see myself in this story. I just had one doubt or thought about your definition of location J. If I am correct, it's the location of residence of the individual. So thinking about my own experience, I might be an outlier though. Wouldn't it make more sense to have location J defined as the location, the workplace? So if people work and go back by bike, they might have some spatial consumer behavior. If they work in the same place but go back by tube or bus, they might have another one. And empirically, with your data, which is great, do you happen to see transactions on weekdays and weekends? You can compare work days and holidays, I mean, non-working days? Thanks.
No, I mean, this is a good, super good point. So in the longer time series that we have, we do not observe daily data. We have monthly data. We have daily data, but only for 2 years of our samples. So we decided to work with the monthly aggregates. But in principle, we can match this data set and look at the do some work on the businesses, kind of divide businesses into those that open on weekends. And for sure, we can try to, with the distribution of employment across the city, we can try to construct a bike market access metric based not on, and this is something that we are going to do, based on work location instead of home location. Yeah. That's a good point. I don't have a good answer to this. Ultimately, you would like to have a more complicated model with 3 types of locations, right? But
to some extent, I guess it goes back to what someone's point about leisure time, working time. No, wait.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, Alessandro, do you have a question? Otherwise, I'm gonna go before you, and then I pass the microphone. Okay, given that I will be short. First of all, I'm very happy that you guys are present today. This is a very good example, as Sandra was saying, how you should conceive and present an empirical work. So I'm very happy that Federica, that you had this first impact today. I have a couple of comments, Federica. The first point is that I think one of the most important results of your work, maybe that might be also another selling line, or maybe the most important selling line, is the substitution effect with cars. I think that's one of the most important motivation to justify yeah. I mean, this is a very good argument, along with revenues from local activities to invest in bike lanes. I think that might be a very good point to justify your empirical analysis. And the second one is more technical, and it's about the impact you find that somehow maybe doesn't account, or I would say maybe it should be disentangled with respect to the effect on the bike supply, the supply of bike users. I mean, I didn't get if the effect on revenues comes from new bikers or the same number of bikers coming from other places. And I think, given that I think you can disentangle this effect, for now I'm suggesting something that is quite tricky, but maybe you might control for car substitution effect, given that we have data. I'm not sure about that, given that it might be kind of bad control, given that it's assumed to be an outcome more than a control, but maybe you can find a way to address this point. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. But you mean, like, when you say controlling for, so we do not have access to information on bike users, unfortunately.
No, you have the change in the car users.
We have the change in car users. Yes.
Might be good control to capture the net effect.
Yeah.
The effect of those who substitute like for cars, for bicycle, and vice versa. But that's my suggestion, because it might be very tricky, you know, referee might be a bad control. Maybe you find an alternative.
My curiosity is more or less linked to the Alessandro's one, and if you can disentangle the effect of tourists in a city such as Paris, since you consider the effect on the new shopping opportunities, and these new shopping opportunities are more or less related to cycling infrastructure, but at the same time, there is a sort of endogeneity, considering that there are a huge amount of tourists that insist in that area, that it can increase as well, and for another reason, the shopping opportunities.
These are French credit cards.
Perfect.
So no tourists in the data.
Not forms.
Okay, yes. Other questions? Any other questions? Okay, thank you. Okay, Federica, so we're glad if you can share this data with us, and And thank you very much for coming, and congratulations for your work. Okay, and thank you very much.
I'm sorry for the delay and the kids that didn't play. I mean, they were really nice. It's weird.
Yeah, it was really a shame. It was a shame.
Okay.
Volevo renderla d'Italia. Non so se me l'ha detto quando stavo al fratello ospedale, comunque oggi ci sono.